Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for week 7 of the Ladies, the Architects Platform Developer 1 Certification Study Group. I can't believe it's already week 7. It seems like there's so much more ground to cover, but we have been trailing away here with the content. So some of the objectives for this week, really our main focus is on testing. So we're going to go through describing the testing framework, what requirements we need for deployment, how to write unit tests for triggers, controllers, and classes, describe when and how to use various sources of test data, describe how to execute one or multiple test classes, and then the differences between invoking Apex and execute anonymous versus unit tests. And I think this is a question that came up a few weeks ago, and I don't think we were able to tackle it, but we will cover that tonight. So let's start off by talking about why it is that we need to test. Why is it so important, and what is the ultimate goal of taking the additional time to test? So the testing framework validates that your code is working as it is supposed to, and it's doing what it was expected to do. It ensures that enhancements and extensions do not break functionality. You need to have a certain percentage of code coverage, and we'll go in that in a further slide, in order to deploy your code to production. And then thinking about successful long-term development, right? You want to make sure that your code that you're deploying is as close to possible as having full coverage, and make sure that you're upkeeping that as time goes on and you are adding in enhancements, that all of your different code classes and everything is working nicely together, and that you remain at a healthy percentage of code coverage. And one thing that I included down here that probably should have been a whole lot bigger than what I put it in as, but for those of you guys who have been doing the plural site, and I know, Brooke, you've been on there with the David Liu Apex Academy courses, and they're wonderful. He always stresses the importance of needing to test your code and write test classes. And he even mentioned that some people kind of do this reverse engineering thing, and they actually code for tests first, and then they start writing their code. So everything that we do should be about testing. And Brooke says, yeah, test, test, test. And I think what it comes down to is it's kind of like a safety net, right? We're on a multi-tenant environment, right? So that's why we have governor limits, and we'll cover that further in this tonight's session. But you want to make sure that your code is as healthy as can be, and it's not going to start breaking things, especially for your org, but that it's not also going to impact overall performance, for your users, for your org, and then as being part of the multi-tenant environment. So let's talk a little bit about a unit test. I mean, this whole thing is going to be about it, but this is like a high-level overview. So some of the features are that we have to write unit tests, we have to run the unit tests, then we have to check the results of the tests, and then we have to make sure that we have the appropriate code coverage. And what are the implications of percentages of code coverage when you're testing in, let's say, a sandbox versus production environment, and why sometimes that varies. So we'll touch upon that in a little bit. And then here are some other bullet points that we should know about unit tests. So unit tests are class methods that ensure that our Apex triggers and our classes, again, are doing what they were intended to do. They allow us to develop without worrying that our code is going to conflict with existing code, and then when we roll out new code, it does the same thing again. And this actually happens as well when Salesforce releases, when they put out the releases, they actually test code for every org. And so then they know, or we know as admins and developers in our organizations and companies, what impact the releases are going to have on the code that we previously had in there. So unit tests are run, again, with every Salesforce upgrade. That's 3 times a year, and it's extra reassurance. We can test single and bulk actions. And we can have a suite of tests or regression tests that can be rerun every time there's an update to class or triggers. And I will say, if anyone wants to chime in, I have to admit, I don't write many unit tests. The only ones that I've done have been through the exercises with Rad Women Code and what I followed online with the plural site classes.
Hey, Blanca?
Yeah.
I had a quick question. So that last bullet, you can have a suite of regression tests that can be run every time there is an update to a class or a trigger. Because one of the things that we have a major problem with right now in our org is regression testing. Nobody's got time to do it. So that's fascinating. I didn't realize that you could. Has anybody else done this? Like used test classes to do regression testing?
I was hoping to have a conversation with one of our developers to see if she can help me out, but this week was too busy, and I don't know. Okay. There's quite a few of us on the line. Does anyone else have experience with this in the workplace?
I'm going to post that to LinkedIn or to Twitter or something, see if we can, because that's a fascinating. I just never would have thought about that.
Yeah, and so where I pull a lot of content from is anything that I learned from Rad Women Code. So you guys are already on the site for the Women Code Heroes. That's a great resource. From the Plural site, Apex Academy, and the other channel courses that Don Robbins shared with us. Although those are not intended to help us pass the certification exam, they're still very relevant and include a wealth of information of like good practices, what you should know that we don't even have an idea that we should know. And then also, trailheads. And focus on force. So whatever we have in content is coming from one or many of those different areas. And maybe keep us posted on what you find on that, Brooke. And then we have some comments here. Jennifer says, I have to explain to developers many times when they make enhancements that they need to go back and update their test classes. Yeah, it's definitely always, needing to keep up to date with everything. And oftentimes the developers do not test for negative scenarios. Yep. And we'll be talking about that in a little bit as well. And that we need to run the local tests when you deploy up your sandboxes. Don't just run the test classes when deploying to production. You don't want to learn during a production deploy that your test class fails. Great point. Well said, Jen.
One other thing to note is like even when you're deploying things like a process builder or flow, it's good to run your tests because it might conflict with a trigger or a class that you have. And learn that when it's in production.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I know that there's quite a few people that still struggle with flow. And I think that that's a great point too for those of us that are not as well, experienced with using flow. It's a great point. Some need to knows. So all the code must execute without throwing any exceptions. And I mentioned this before, but we do need to pay attention to governor limits because they do apply to our test methods. And while all triggers must have test coverage, that doesn't mean that every line of code in your trigger needs to have coverage. And we'll talk about that in, I think it's like in 2 slides coming up. And then you can run parallel test execution, and that can help to speed up test run time. And coverage can vary when the @ is test annotation is used. There are some limitations included. Like for instance, they cannot send outbound emails and cannot perform callouts to web services. So those are just some kind of mindful tips of what we should know as it relates to unit tests.
Hey, Blanca, what is that last bullet? Not the last bullet. The code coverage can vary when is test annotation is used. What does that mean?
We're going to cover this is test annotation in a second, and folks can feel free to chime in on that as well.
Okay.
See. So, and here it goes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about now the unit test structure. And you have to forgive me because I realize I haven't even been looking at my notes on my printed slide deck. Okay. So we want to set up all conditions for testing. So basically, we need to create valid test data for testing, and we need to go through and look at the code that we're writing the unit tests for, and we need to check where it is that we have criteria conditions that we need to have that need to be met one way or another. Because when we go to test, we have to make sure that we are actually testing for each and every one of those conditions, and it's easy to miss things. I know that there was a note, maybe Brooke, you can remind me if it was Pluralsight or somewhere else, I can't remember, but the if statements are known to be an area where people sometimes lose code coverage because things get lost in translation with code, and sometimes you're not always testing for each of the conditions that are in that if statement. So those are some notes. And for number 2, we'll call the class method or trigger being tested. So the method being tested can be called directly from the test method, and we can execute methods being tested. We have the last point here, which is very, very, very important. And somebody brought it up, I want to say maybe it was during the Rad Women course, and I don't know if maybe you guys heard this, for those of you guys have been part of cohorts in the past, but this is not an option. It's not like you can opt in or opt out to do the system assertions. I mean, this is something that your code has to have, your unit test, in order to make sure that they're fully completed. Because they are actually, the system assertions are verifying that the results of our unit tests are accurate. And again, if you don't have it included, then that means you're not really testing for everything. You're testing, your unit tests are incomplete. If the system data asserts, the assertions verify test results, whether expected results are met or not. And if they are not, then it will throw an exception. And then we have here, Brooke asked the question, so when we talk about the @is test and @test method, these are actually some key words when it comes to coding for unit tests, and there's different ways to, how can I say this, I guess start an area of code for tests, and we're going to talk a little bit about that when we get to the demo area. Let's see. Okay, so a little bit more about testing frameworks. Writing unit test. How, for those of you guys who have had experience with either reading unit tests or practicing unit tests, or you actually have to do this in the workplace, how do you know what lines need to be tested? We mentioned earlier that not every line of code needs to be tested. So how can we identify what types of lines of code need to be tested and what not? After DML statements, Olivia has. Anyone else? Yes, you don't need to test lists. Yeah, and these are good pointers. So Brooke actually tackled some of the second line. What lines don't you need to worry about? So let's give some examples here. How do you know what lines need to be tested? Basically, I kind of already hinted at this, but I didn't like really stress it, but now I do want to emphasize it, that whatever code we have if we have conditions, then we need to make sure we have test code that tests those conditions are met. So any business logic within a method, we have to make sure they're tested. All code that you want to deploy, you should have tests for those, whether it's code that's inside a trigger or code that's inside a class, or maybe you have some Apex code in a Visualforce page. Basically, where we have code and it includes business logic, we want to test it. Loops need testing. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Great example there. And then what are some of the examples of when we don't have to worry about writing unit tests for code? And Brooke already mentioned one, that we don't need to test lists. If you have comments in your code, you don't have to worry about those comment lines. And yes, everyone should be putting in comments at all times, and you'll see it included in the demo that I have, and it's kind of part of coding. You have to have comments, some kind of documentation that explains what's going on in that code. Let's see, where did I leave off? Oh, you also do not have to worry about system debug statements in test class definitions. And again, some of the other parts of this framework, we have to run the unit test. We have to check the results. We have to generate that code coverage and make sure that we have above what's the minimum percentage, which is 75%. And we'll talk about that more on the next slide. But one bullet that I forgot to add, and I'll get that in tonight right after our session, so that if you guys download it, you'll have the most up-to-date. But unit tests do not commit changes to the database. And we're going to talk about this in one of the later slides for tonight. So because unit tests are not committing changes to the database, we don't have to stress out and worry about going back and deleting that data. Okay, so a little bit about deployment requirements. So code coverage must be over 75% to deploy. Now, this is an area where everyone will say, do not strive just to hit that 75%, because oftentimes what happens, as Jen said, we should be testing in sandboxes, most definitely. What happens is you don't want to be very close to that 75, and then you go to deploy, and then you fall short. So who can tell me what is a good goal for us to try to aim for when we're looking at code coverage? What amount do you think is sufficient? Brooke, 100%. Jennifer, we aim for 90 or higher. Yeah. So does it seem 100% like we cannot do it? I think sometimes, yes, we may fall kind of in this, I don't want to say a black hole, but I think sometimes, you know, we get intimidated when we're not getting the response that we're looking for to meet code coverage. And I think that, you know, everyone knows that coding is time consuming, and it's time consuming for a reason, right? We have to make sure that when we're coding, it's doing what it was intended to do. It makes sense. We don't have loops that go on forever. We need to make sure that it's actually, if you're looking at a business process, it's following the accurate process that we had intended the code to do. And that means that for testing, it may take longer to hit that mark of being above the 75%. And so, yeah, we should never, ever, ever strive to be at 75. 100 is achievable, but again, I think that sometimes we have to pick our battles, right? So I think that sometimes if you're not exactly hitting the 100, I don't think that that's going to break anything. But I think we should always set the bar as high as we can, because you never know what ripple effect it's going to have. When you, if let's say you're testing and deploy, you're testing in sandbox to deploy later. And when you deploy, when it's into production, maybe there's some other packages or some other code that's in there. You know, Jen brought up process builders and flows, and what happens is you don't want to have less code coverage in things that are already in the system. And even though you have close to 75, when you're testing in sandbox, when you push it through, you're going to lose that. It's not going to work. So we do want to aim as high as we can get. And I want to go back to a note that Jen included in the chat earlier. She said you write tests to run as the actual user and not as the system admin. The system admin has access to everything. So your test results may be inaccurate. And that's a great point. And we'll talk about running tests as the user, the current user that's logged in, and versus another user later in the slides. Oh, this is a great one. Do not cheat to get code coverage. Jennifer, that's an awesome one. Thank you for throwing that out there. Yeah, in the end, if you do that, you're really only cheating yourself and the org, and you're going to end up in big trouble later. So you might as well invest the time and a little bit of pain points and struggles to work it out to get your code coverage at a higher and much healthy percentage. Do not use view all data in your test class. Create test data and use it in test classes. And do not use real data in the org. And this is a good point. We're going to come to this in a minute, Jennifer, so thank you for bringing that up. Or perhaps it is see all data or something like that. Yeah. And Brooke has a few questions here. Someone mentioned to me that you could create a test data factory that you could call from your test class. I'm trying to think about that for a minute. Is it possible? I think maybe I know what you're talking about, and maybe we'll see that in the demo. If not, Brooke, can you at that time unmute and bring up this again, and we can see if we can answer that. You mean you can cheat? Yeah. Oh, and Samat says yes to Brooke's question about a test factory. Okay, so let's get back to the slides, but great chats going on there, and thank you for including chats. I know it's a little discouraging when sometimes the bandwidth issue, we always get scared to unmute, and then we lose audio and time with each other. Okay, so back to deployment requirements. If you have less than 75% coverage, you either need to modify your test methods or you have to write more test methods. So I don't know that there's a general rule of thumb of which one is the preferred, or if there's different scenarios of when you might go back and modify your test method versus writing more test methods. If anybody can share some thoughts on that, that is one question that I am curious about that I had hoped to ask our developer and I didn't have time this week. But those are your two options. If you're not meeting that 75%, write more tests or go back and modify the test methods that you have until you can reach above that threshold. Classes and triggers must have successful compiles and are executed error-free. Test classes and methods do not count as part of your overall coverage. So you're writing your test classes and methods to obtain coverage, but you don't have to write test on test. That's not going to get you anywhere. It doesn't count towards your overall coverage. And changes to metadata must match in both your sandbox and your production environments. Okay, so I think Brooke mentioned negative testings, and we're going to cover this here, and I think we have an example in the demo as well. Some things that we should take into consideration as it comes to testing. We need to test for expected conditions. So expected conditions are conditions that we have in our code that we're writing the test for, right? We want to make sure that those are met. And we also want to test for unexpected conditions. So unexpected conditions sometimes could be a business process. Maybe it's you don't want to hit governor limits. I mean, it's pretty much things that you can't anticipate from the code that you previously wrote, but they're just kind of good best practices of things you should look out for. So that's pretty much where the category of unexpected conditions comes in. And you want to test for missing or bad data, because that's not going to help us. So we do want to make sure that as we're writing unit tests, we're looking for these. And then the boundary conditions. So Brooke mentioned already negative. You also want to test for positive. You want to test when it comes to the numbers that you're expecting. You want to test for anything that returns back as zeros, because sometimes that's not what your code was meant to do. So you want to make sure that you're looking and taking into consideration these boundaries and have tests for each of them. It's not like you pick and choose, oh, for this code section, I want to test for positive, and oh, when this other piece of code, this other class, I want to test for negative. Like you can't mix match. You should always be mindful and looking to test for all or as many as you can. And yeah, Brooke brought up a really great point with null values. You want to test for null values too. And then Jennifer kind of mentioned this with a little bit, but not very specific. But part of why you want to make sure that you're testing as the user, not the admin, is because sometimes there's also user restrictions and it has an impact on your code behavior. And so that's one of the other things that we should take into consideration. And of course, we're always trying to bulkify when we can, as much as possible. So testing for bulkifying is another point. Okay. So here we're going to hit on a little bit about mindfulness as it comes to governor limits when testing. So governor limits, we already mentioned, we do need to pay attention to because they do apply to test methods. And we can use methods to test the governor limits. So I've included here two, the test.start.test, and then these two parentheses here are just indicating that it's a method. This indicates the beginning. And then at the end, we would see a test.stop test, and this would indicate where the method ends. And I haven't seen this in practice for myself, but maybe Sumath or someone else, if you can weigh in. But I read that whatever code you include in between those two will get a new set of governor limits. And again, I can't tell you, 100% how that looks or the background to that, but if anyone can shine some light on that, that is something that I was wondering. So Sumat says, yeah, that's right. So we're always worried about those governor limits, right? So we never want to hit those. And, this is just some of the things we can use or leverage for us to make sure that we don't hit them. And then there are also limit methods that can show us the amount of resources that are both used and resources available. So they're down here. We have the get callouts, which would provide the number of callouts already processed. And then there's get limit callouts, which would give us what's the total number of callouts available. And I think Jen mentioned data. So some of the options for test data sources we have here. So test setup methods, test utility class, pre-existing data, and we can also create data, via our Apex code. We can also create test data from static resources. We've been talking quite a bit about how do we use static resources, and this is just one little example. and then price book entries. So these are different options for the various test data sources that we have as it relates to unit testing. Okay. So here, actually I'm gonna go over this page first. Here I have a little snippet of code. This is not the entire one, but I'll go through a walkthrough of this right after this slide. But what I wanted to do was kind of include somewhat of an outline, because we may be saying, okay, I know we need all these tests and make sure that we have the right coverage, but I don't know where to start with. How in the world do I write a test class? So here in this box, in this yellow one, it's kind of like a little bit of an outline of where we would start when we want to make sure we include. So before we even start the class, we're going to use the @test annotation. And so it's a little bit hard to see, but let me see if I can. That only makes it smaller. Oh, here it goes. A little bit bigger now. And then we give the test class a name, which is what we see here in line 3, just after the private class. Then we have the name, contact handler _ test. And then this is not so much what you see here in these lines of code, but this is more so going back to the code that we're writing the tests for. Read each line of code that you have and pick out where you see any conditions, because we already know that if there's any business logic, if there's any conditions, we need to make sure that they're met. We need to make sure that we have test coverage for. So go through and look for those. And then again, if statements can be one of the biggest culprits to why it is that we're missing out on code coverage. And it could be huge chunks too. So we got to make sure that we're being super mindful within the if statements to not miss any of the conditions. And then we need a final line for DML. So we'll see here, I think it's line, if I can see right, 14 on this, where we have an update. So that is what we're talking about, is having DML. And then a system debug line, which I actually don't have one in this example here in the screenshot. But oftentimes it's nice to include a system debug so that you can go back and check and see what the code is returning. So I know that's a lot, and I'm gonna see what we have going on in the chat box here. Jen says, yes, use the test utility class so test data is not created in each test class, but you can write the test data once and reference it from multiple test classes. And you maintain test data in one place. Example, creating test users, test counts, test contacts, etc. Yes, give a test method a meaningful name. Not test 1, test 2, test 3. It's not helpful. I agree with you on that one. And then Samath included a few links here for some test utility classes. In the Dev Console, Jen says, when you look at the test results for class or trigger, you can see what is covered in your test class. Blue is covered and red is not. And that's a great point, Jen. And we'll be going through that next week, actually. with debugging and deployment. Okay, so let's go into the demo, and actually I need to take out my other notes here. And again, I just want to reiterate that I personally don't have a whole lot of experience creating test classes, but what I do have, I'm actually repurposing what we use for an exercise during our Rad Women Code course. Okay, so I guess I have to share my other screen. I'm just trying to switch screens here. Can somebody tell me if they can see my developer console up now?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, so we had an exercise of creating a contact trigger handler. And one of the things we had to do in the later weeks was then start learning how to write these tests. And I will say that this is not something that comes easy to me. I mean, I did do programming back in undergrad. But this is something you may have to sit with for some time. Maybe, you know, go through the Pluralsight and the trailheads and different resources a few times. And it's going to be one of those things that you just have to practice. And you get better the more and more you practice. And I would say that you also need to take things with a grain of salt when you're first starting. Don't be too hard on yourselves. I know we don't have to code for the PD1 certification, but we have to understand you know, how to read it and some of the foundation behind what code or what are they asking us, right? And which code looks like it's right for that scenario or which ones are wrong. And so I would say that take as much time as you need. I would say I'm not the best one to break this down on the fly. I have a printout of this and I have my whole page marked up with notes. And do whatever you have to do to dissect things for you and just kind of keep some reminders in your head of, you know, what are we looking at in the examples that we see in different places and how it is that we can apply that in real life. And oh, it looks like Mark joined us. Glad you can join us. Okay, so okay, I'm just reading these notes because I think they're from like 2 days ago. Okay, so we already talked about the is test annotation, and we mentioned that it should go before your class. So that's like the very first thing that we see up here. What we see next is that we're stating private. So we're stating that this test class is private, not public, meaning that it's private only for this isolated code we're using here, and I'll come back to that in a second. Here, we're stating that this is a class, and here we're giving it a name. And as Jennifer mentioned, give it a name that's meaningful. And especially in the workplace, I mean, for me, I'm kind of a organized / neat freak. And so I really take the time to, all my file names are like, you know, make sense and they're in folders. But you want to make sure that you can kind of pair things up, because as you start having to write more tests and just coding in general, you don't want to be so generic that you can't pinpoint what that class is or what. So if you notice, the name of it is Contact Handler Test, and the actual trigger name is right next to it. I have it open on another tab. It's Contact Trigger Handler here in this gray tab up here. So that's, you know, just a naming convention, be meaningful so that you can easily pair what it is that you're looking at when you're opening up these code files. And here you'll notice that we have another @is test. And there was some back and forth as we were learning this, because you may see some places @is test, and then other places you may see test method. And we were trying to figure out, well, what's the general rule of thumb of when you should use which one and how often. And so one thing that we learned is that these actually help you when you include more than one, because when you go to start executing the code to run the test, you'll have more, what should I say it, like not subcategories, but subsections based on how many of these that you have. So then you can just kind of see a little bit more detailed. Instead of just having everything lumped in under one @is test, it's better to use them as meaningful as possible. And so here, basically, I'm going to come back up because I passed up one of the things that I meant to mention. But we said here that this private, I mentioned that this class would be isolated from other code. And I know it came up during our course when we were learning about test classes, like, well, why wouldn't you just leave it as public? But the reason why we're choosing private, and the way that I interpreted this so that it made sense in my head, was that it allows you to marry your test to specific classes. So it's keeping this test class in kind of an isolated area. You are calling on your trigger or your class that you're writing the test class for, but you're not paying attention and mixing it in with all of the other classes and triggers that you have, all of the other test classes. That gets pretty hairy. So here you're kind of just zoning in and saying, okay, here is my contact handler test class, and here is my contact trigger handler class. And as you're working through these tests, you're only really looking at those and not really paying attention to all of what else is going on in your org. And one note is that if you have it as public, if you're testing another class or run other tests, then you don't always, in the public side, you don't always achieve that 75% for code coverage. So from my understanding, it's better to keep it as private. And if anyone else can chime in on that, you're more than welcome to, because I am not an expert in this. I'm just interpreting how it was that they walked us through what this is doing and how I interpret what we should be mindful and look forward to when we're writing unit tests. So let's go here to where did I leave? The second add is test. So the static void, and then here is another class name we have, or the method, sorry, sample positive test. So we're making note is test. We're kind of having a subtest inside, right? Static test method void sample positive test for a method level, or we use this at is test for a way of identifying that, and it's saying these methods are also test. So we have one test that starts up here, we have a second test that starts right here. And this is the first method. And we're actually, if you read the comments, so here you'll see I have a line of comment that was developed for us when they were teaching us this. We're actually running a positive test here. So Brooke mentioned, you know, sometimes folks don't test for negative, and then I covered the slide where we have to look at all the different boundaries that we need to make sure we have test for. So this one is actually a positive one. And again, when you have these comments, you don't have to write, or you don't have to look at covering that line of code for your test code coverage. And some other things that we need to think about with writing unit tests. Test methods perform operations on data, which means we need to set up the data, right? And I think Jennifer mentioned earlier on, you know, that we should be cautious. I forgot which data. There's something in the comments I lost sight of what she mentioned earlier, but she brought up, and we did cover the slide about the different data sources for tests. And then there's also a different annotation that we use to test data setup, which is not in our slides, but it is at test setup, and I'll go back and include that before you guys start downloading this from the Google Drive. And again, we create our own data. We're not using existing data. And again, we're not committing anything when we're running unit tests to the database, so we don't have to worry about having to go back in there and delete anything. I am actually going to scroll here. If we look at this insert to C, C is the S object, and this is actually the DML. Remember we mentioned that we should have a DML statement in our test methods, so that is an example here. And then here, scrolling down to this section, we have here select ID from contact, where the ID equals, and then we have the binding ID here. So we talked about binding, I don't know, 1 or 2 sessions ago. So here we have an example of that. And we have here the parent to child or the inner child SOCL query. So one thing to note is that if it was the reverse and we wanted a query that was child to parent, then that's when we would use the dot notation that we had reviewed previously. I think Mark has some jokes in there. Thanks for always keeping us on our toes when it's so late over here in Central Time. Jennifer says, is test see all data equals true? Annotations, open up data access to records in your organization. If you use that and run your test classes, your test would impact production data. That is very enlightening, Jen, and thank you so much for including that in there. So, folks, I will include an update on our slides to make sure that we have this. And if you're reading the chats, look at Jen's last comment about is test, and then see all data equals true. Yeah, test start tests and test stop tests are always to identify the parts of code that we're doing tests versus parts of setting up test data. And we covered that a little bit. Okay, so walk through, let's see, where did I leave off? Oh, here we have a system dot assert, right? We talk about having assertions and that we have to make sure that we're verifying that the results are what they should be, right? So again, if you're writing unit tests and you do not have assertions, then your job is not done. You gotta go back and make sure you include them. So here is where we're actually validating, right? Because we had a condition that we had a test for, and we needed to make sure that it's returning true. And if it's returning true, then it's a positive test. So again, this is part of, we talked about the different boundaries. Here's my sample positive test, and then here is where I'm validating that it is positive. And then here we have an example of a negative test. So Brooke brought this up, and yes, we should try to test for as many of these boundaries as we can. It's not that every scenario, at least when I phrased the question back, I don't know, months ago when we were learning this, that you have to include all boundaries every time, but you should really try as much as possible to cover as much ground to test for boundaries as you can. So this is actually a second method. And again, I have the annotation at is test. And again, here we have, it's for sample negative test. And I did mention, but I'll point it out again because I have it here in my notes, and I made sure I wanted to stress this, that the more you're using this at is test when you have a new test class or test method, it's easier because when you start checking for your code coverage in the test tab options, you have more options listed there. Okay, so here we have the negative test. And the only change from this code to the code above is actually that this one is including the email. So it's actually pretty much a copy and paste, but here we have updated it to include the email, and this is testing for negative now. And we still have our DML, which is right here. And again, the C is our S object that is holding all of the data for us. And then if I scroll down just a little bit here, I have another assertion. And in this case, we're expecting 0 to be returned because we want it to be negative. And so in this case, if you're following the comments, email with no cases created, it's going to be negative because in the code, if you are reading it very thoroughly, and I might even copy and paste this out into a Google Doc in our week 7 folder so that you guys can have it and kind of see what all the comments are and just what sample test class looks like. But we actually needed it to be both and make sure that it shouldn't be null. And then here we have a failing test method. And those of you guys might ask, well, why is it that this looks funky, right? I got these weird things, symbols here, and it's all brown. It doesn't look like the code above. And actually, these 2 files were part of a whole package that Red Women Code had prepared for all of the students. And so from my understanding, you cannot install a managed package if it has failing tests. So they actually had to comment it out so that we could install the managed package. But here is an example of another unit test. Here we are looking for a failing test method. And I'll stress one last time, the @is test allows us to kind of have a subset and that we can pick and choose versus one huge block of test code that you have to go back in and change everything every time. So somebody, and I forget who, forgive me, in the chat box mentioned, maybe it was Jen, it's best practice to not include all of your tests in one huge area. It's fine to have, here I have one specific test class, contact handler _test, and all of these tests are very specific to this one class in my org, right? So you don't have to worry about having too many files. I mean, the more you can break it down, the easier it will be, because like Jen said, if you have to roll out enhancements or someone else is altering code for whatever reasons, maybe they're changing the logic and the business process in the code, and so then they have to go back and change the test, right, to reflect that. And if it's all in one space, one chunk, it gets very easy to get lost and not exactly get the right amount of coverage because it's not really specific and isolated to the certain classes and methods that you're writing these for. Let's see what we have here in the chat. Mark says, had an architect at TDX tell me a story about someone with, oh my God, 4,500 lines of Apex code in tests and no assertions in the whole test class. So I thought it was just a myth because this question came up back when we were learning about this, and that's why our coaches, Leslie and Cynthia, really stressed to, like, no, go back, keep writing your unit tests because you need to have them in there. And you might want to have standard classes too to generate test data. Good point, Smart. Okay, so I'm back at the failing test method. And just a few things I want to point out here. Why is it that this method is failing? So if you look at line 46, we're passing an account ID. And that's not what we were expecting. And then if you see here in the assertion, we should actually expect 0, but we didn't. We got 1. So that means, again, it just validates that we're getting what we expected for this failing test method that we wrote. Okay, so let's switch back. And again, I'll update the slides, combine some of these great points that were brought up in the chat box because I don't want to lose sight of those. I think that it's very important for us to be as prepared as possible when it comes to getting ready to take the exam, and then just knowing as much as possible, you know, so that we can start writing unit tests for our own practice and maybe later down the line for the workplace. I'm trying to switch to the slide deck again. Can someone let me know if you can see the slide deck?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So now that you had a very short glimpse at what a test class looks like and the different types of boundaries that we may test for, I just want to emphasize that this slide is nice. You don't see all the code in this snapshot. That wasn't the objective for this slide, but more so just to kind of give you somewhat of an outline and things that we should make sure that we're including and not losing sight of when we're writing the code. So if you can spend some time and just kind of remembering these, it's a good starting point for you to sit down and then actually start writing some test classes. Okay, and we did the developer console code walkthrough. Now let's talk a little bit about how do we run the tests, right? There's different ways, and some of them are in the Salesforce.com platform, and some of them are not. And you can see here that we have a list. So on the user interface, there's Apex test execution. I'm not sure what this Git code coverage was, but it was listed. So if anyone can shine some light on that one, that would be great, because I have no idea really what that was, and I meant to look it up and I didn't get around to it tonight. You can also use the Force.com IDE APIs. You already saw that we were in the developer console. For next week, we have debugging and deployment for week 8. So we'll see actually running it, looking at, you know, the debug logs and looking at where we can tell our test code coverage and all of that. And then the user interface, run all tests. And then now we're going to talk a little bit about think it was maybe Andrew who asked about execute anonymous. I forget which session it was. And I know that we were talking, Jen brought up a good point about you want to make sure that you run the test as a user and not as the admin, because the admin has access to everything, but also because there may be user restrictions that you need to think about how that impacts code behavior as well. So let's go through. Here we have a block on execute anonymous, and then how it relates or how it differs to unit tests. So let's go through execute anonymous. So we already mentioned that the data changes are not committed on the unit test side, which is over here. So this may be a little bit redundant of some things we've covered already tonight, but at least it's a one-stop shop to see where they fall with each one of these. So again, for execute anonymous, code is not stored in the org. Data changes are committed. The user-defined methods do not test code functionality. And it runs as the current user. And it can be executed via the developer console. Again, we mentioned force.com IDE and a SOAP API. And it's executed in user mode with sharing. And we cannot reset governor limits with execute anonymous. And there's no code coverage on anonymous blocks. Now, on the other hand, we have the unit test. So code is stored in your org. The data not changed. The test methods do verify code functionality, and the test can be run as other user. And the unit test can also be run in the user interface and all of the same as the left-hand side over here. And code is executed in system mode. It does not. So this is, you see there's a lot of reverse here from the left side to the right side. The code is executed in system mode and does not have sharing. Here we can reset governor limits, and it does provide code coverage. And what's the percentage we need again for code coverage? What's the minimum percent? And then what is, 75 or more. And of course, we always want to aim for 100 because we're overachievers and we want to be perfect coders. No, I was being sarcastic, but we should try to get as high as we can. And then I think we have a few comments here. Mark says, skip code coverage. Yeah, sometimes we can't get to 100%. I've heard some stories about that. Does somebody want to elaborate on that? Not being able to get to 100? Like, what are some reasons why we can't?
I don't know how well my microphone works, so hopefully you all can hear me.
Yeah.
It's some odd scenario situations that come up that there are certain things, and I've actually seen someone who goes, this is bad code syntax, but it makes it up to 100% as far as programmers, because they end up like, you have code coverage or readability, choose one, is one of the scenarios where you can't get up to 100%. So you either make it more readable or you make it 100% coverage, but there's like some things that people will split out over to multiple lines just to make it easier to read. But in turn, there's things on a line that you can't actually test explicitly.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that, but that is a very good point. I could see that.
And the skip code coverage is just a feature that you can use. So if you want to find out if your tests pass or fail, you can have it not scan for code coverage.
Oh, okay. So let me just show that one really quick, because for those of you guys who didn't see the chat, Mark included this link here. Oh yeah, here we go, the skip code coverage. So I'm going to make sure, and actually you have to forgive me, I did not have time to pull a resource slide, but I'll do that tonight so that tomorrow when we make the announcement that the recording is up, you guys have some more links, because I had to spend a lot of time on this area because it's super foreign for me. Again, the only test classes that I have experience with is writing for our final project for the Rad Women Code. And I can't even say that I'm entirely comfortable with with that code, and I haven't gone back and refactored, which is why I just repurposed their live session example that they used to teach us. So yeah, but thanks, Mark, for looking this one up for us. Let me come back. Okay. I think we should be back on the slides. There's a lot of ground to cover with tests. I would say you're not going to remember everything. And what we just have to do is go back to, you know, like, for instance, this slide where it's knowing the execute anonymous versus the unit test. You know, go back to some of these, why we use unit tests, what are some of the features, some of the need to knows. If you can just kind of keep a higher level of these and then maybe look at the sample code that I'll drop in our week 7 Google Drive, I think it'll be helpful for you, because you don't have to code, but just being familiar, not being intimidated when you see a whole lot of code, I think is a great icebreaker, and it takes everyone a different amount of time to get comfortable looking at code. And sometimes you have to sit with it. And literally, if I take a picture of my notes from that test class that we walked through, I literally have writing everywhere, and even on top of the lines of code that were printed originally, because it takes me some time to go through it and try to understand it and break it down. And it's practice. Again, remember the deployment requirements. Here's, again, the governor limits. You know, just kind of go back to some of these more, be cautious of this, and don't forget to include assertions, and think about that. And Mark, actually, do you have any tips for us on the test areas from the beta exam?
They don't talk a whole lot about tests in the beta exam from what I remember. There are a couple questions on tests as far as like identifying the is tests, identifying the can view all data assertion, a few things like a ton of stuff on testing. I know with the, like, there isn't stuff. Now there is stuff on the developer console and tracing stuff that's in your tests and running your tests in the developer console, viewing your code coverage. There was stuff related to that. So there wasn't a ton of stuff about the tests from a code perspective, but there is a lot from the kind of the operational and like architectural perspective of it.
Okay. And then Brooke, are you still on the line? Because I know that you actually wrote your first test class, right? After completing the Pluralsight Apex Academy course. Do you want to share maybe just a little bit about that, writing your first test class? Or maybe she had to go. It looks like there's some other comments in here too. So test for error exception handling. I know developers have said it's hard to catch for certain exceptions. That is a good question, Jennifer. Also, Jennifer has, I only wrote a test class myself for Red Women. Yeah, me too. But know what to look for in a test class is because I'm part of a governance review board at work, and we look out for certain things for test classes and coverage, what are best and bad practices. Yeah, I'll have to admit, Mark, I think I kind of overheard a conversation, and I remember someone saying, oh my God, I'm embarrassed at, at some of what I've seen in our test classes. And this was some time ago, somebody, I think it was at one of our Saturday, Salesforce Saturday or somewhere, when some user group or somewhere, we were just having general conversations and talking about, you know, developers and what goes into it and how sometimes they don't always do the best job. I mean, yeah, I guess you get that with any position, but I feel like, you know, as we're looking at achieving a Platform Developer 1 certification, does that mean that right after we achieve that certification, we're all going to be developers and start coding? Yes, or maybe no, maybe not right away. You know, we all will move at a pace that makes most sense for us. Mark says, I wish I could share the code I had to review and read today as an almost perfect example of how not to write code. Yeah. Had no comments. The variable names are super short. Lots of revised codes commented out, but totally disorganized. Yeah. You have to put time into it. I think it's, you know, garbage in, garbage out is what I learned way back in the day when I was studying object-oriented programming. And I think it was my COBOL teacher, actually. I loved her. She was very strict, but she was very blunt, and she made us work hard and push the limits. We were just starting to break the ice with learning these topics, and that was her biggest thing, was garbage in, garbage out. And again, you can't take shortcuts. Someone mentioned in the chat box earlier, cheating. You don't want to cheat with your tests. You're only in the end going to be cheating yourself and your org, your company. That is about all I have for tonight. Before I make some announcements, I do want to just open it up if anybody has any questions you want us to hash out as a group, or any comments or anything you want to bring up. Fake methods are awful. Fake methods, wow. Okay, well, don't be bashful. If you think of something, unmute or chat it. I have the chat box open. So announcement number 1. I'd like to just let everyone know that I was in communication with Don Robbins, and I did thank him because he did give us a number of Pluralsight seat passes that some of us have used. I think some of us more than others. But I did make an announcement when he offered it to us that if we could gather some feedback for him, not anything with your name on it, just very anonymous, high level, which courses did you look at, spend some time with, and what did you find helpful, and what would you like to see in the future? If you can take a few minutes to answer a very, very short survey about the plural class seats, if you utilize that during our time, I'll probably look at developing that survey tomorrow and launching an email out to everyone who requested a seat. So if you didn't request a seat, don't worry, you don't have to look for the survey. I'll only be sending it out to the subset of us that actually use the 30-day pass. And again, it's not anything you know, that he'll see who said what. It's more so he just wants to get a generalized view on what we thought of what they have on Pluralsight as it relates to, you know, platform developer topics. Not so much that it's going to prepare us to pass the certification, but just more so about the various topics that fall and relate to Platform Developer 1. And then I do want to mention we are winding down. So next week we're going to cover debug and deployment. You know, I will say if anyone wants to co-present with me, that would be great because I am not totally experienced. And now that Mark mentioned that there's going to be quite a bit about looking at the developer console and things in there. I mean, I can give an overview of what I learned, but I'm not looking at that type of stuff every day, and I'm not totally experienced in that. So if anyone, or even if you just want to chime in and unmute yourself during the next session, that would be great. And then we'll be concluding after that. So we have one more session. And then hopefully everyone will be either studying independently some more or scheduling their exam. And I think Brooke already scheduled hers. I think I read somewhere the end of this month. I'm trying to aim for something around there too. So we'll see how things go. In the meanwhile, I don't see any new questions coming in the chat box. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining me tonight, and I look forward to our next session.